Greetings and salutations, friends. I promised you a Skaven Tactics video, and I will deliver. Now, sadly and inexplicably, Creative Assembly has not seen fit to send me an alpha build of the game itself, so I won't have any real way to visualize to you exactly what I'm talking about, so I'll try to explain it as detailed as I am able. I could of course try and draw some diagrams in Microsoft Paint, but I do not want to inflict eye cancer upon you just yet. So, what is it that makes the Skaven Army so different from, for example, historical armies? Well, during the course of human history, we have more or less standardized the way we fought into certain eras. For example, you have the ancient times, and we're talking like Egypt pre-Rome here, where large-scale battles were very much so a chaotic affair. There was very little overall control. The two armies met, the two armies fought, whoever ran away first just lost. There was very little tactical insight in this kind of fighting. We move on to some more advanced stuff with the Romans, originally starting out with hoplite formations copied from the Greeks, and again, the hoplite formations were not particularly tactically adept. It was mostly a case of a bunch of heavily armored dudes attempting to push another bunch of heavily armored dudes out of their way, with some innovations like the Macedonian phalanx, which made pushing the other bunch of armored dudes out of the way a hell of a lot easier. But essentially what you have is lines of dudes slamming into lines of dudes, and whoever breaks and runs first is the loser. With only minor evolutions of weaponry and tactics over the next 2,000 or so years, all the way up until we start getting muskets. And even when we get to the point in time where muskets is the primary weapon on the battlefield, in the Napoleonic era for example, it's still essentially just lines of dudes fighting lines of slightly different dudes. Except now they're fighting them less by beating the shit out of them, and more by firing extremely inaccurate weapons at them. It is only extremely recently, in the Second World War, that we really started to move away from this. Even in the First World War, we were mostly using line battle tactics, which is why we had such horrendous casualties in that war. Because tactic and strategy simply just hadn't caught up to the innovations in weapons. Now, in Warhammer, even the most technologically advanced races have only come to the point where we have black powder musket weaponry. Even rifling is an extremely rare thing in the Warhammer universe. And as such, most races adopt a very simple line of battle tactic, with infantry in the front, archers in the back, cavalry on the flanks, and some war machines situated on hills. There are exceptions, like the ogres, for example, who prefer the head-on rush, or the Tomb Kings that employ a much more mobile variety of warfare. But one of the biggest departures that still holds some resemblance with this kind of line warfare is exemplified by the Skaven. The Skaven rely on a formation that bears a striking similarity to the classical Roman legion deployment of a triple line formation, where you have the rawest untested recruits in the front, with the more veteran men behind them, and then your best men forming the last rank of spearmen. And in many ways, the Skaven emulate this with a few slight adjustments. You have a front rank of Skaven Slaves. These, however, do not fulfill the Roman army's goal of essentially being a rank of shock infantry, where you hope to break the enemy on the first charge, and if you don't, you hope to exhaust the enemy enough for the veterans behind them to clear out the rest. The Skaven have a fairly different approach. The Skaven Slaves are not there to break the enemy. They are there to wear them out, but more so physically than numerically. The Skaven Slaves' primary objective is to eat as much enemy weapon fire as possible, protecting the clan rats behind them and tiring the enemy out in melee combat against hordes on hordes upon hordes of extremely cheap and extremely expendable Skaven Slaves. The Skaven Slaves are then expected to turn and run after eating enough enemy fire and holding back the enemy for a little while, soaking up the worst of their charge. In fact, the Skaven Slaves are not only expected to run, they are relied upon to run, to such an extent that while in most normal Warhammer armies, if a friendly unit retreats through another friendly unit, that unit has to take a leadership test. They see their allies retreating, they might panic. But the Skaven are quite different. Clan rats will not care the slightest bit about Skaven slaves retreating past them or through their unit. They expect the Skaven slaves to retreat, and rather than seeing that as a sign of panic, they see it more as an amusing sideshow to the upcoming slaughter. And so, after having expended most of the enemy's missile weaponry and worn down some of their soldiers, the clan rats move in to try and mop up the rest. Now, even this is not by any means the final line, so to say. The clan rats wish to use the Skaven slaves as a means of halting the enemy, so that the clan rats, upon the Skaven slaves routing, can charge the enemy using their weight of numbers to try and push them back, or hopefully even break them. But even then, the Skaven army is not such a simple 1-2 punch. The clan rats, not being particularly good fighters, are by no means guaranteed to actually be able to break the enemy front ranks. Instead, they become a form of secondary holding force, allowing flanking units like rat ogres, giant rats, and zany war machines like the Doom Wheel to hedge around the enemy and hammer them in the flank. And if the enemy manages to fight off this second wave, and even manages to survive the flank charges, there are still further waves of clan rats waiting to attack them. And while these flank charges are taking place, the enemy are not only fighting clan rats to their front, they're also taking rather horrendous casualties from the various Skaven weapon teams that are heedlessly of their allies firing into melee. Not caring if they're hitting allies, simply because if a weapon team kills 3 Skavens and kills but a single enemy, that's a net gain. And so, even if the enemy manages to survive the second wave and somehow manages to withstand the flanking assaults, the enemy army is by now, in all due probability, torn into tatters and rags by the waves upon waves of Skavens and monsters thrown upon them, and now they have to withstand the third and final wave of Storm Vermin, the elite heavily armored Skaven, placed in the back not so much because they are the best, although they are, but placed in the back more so that they can be kept safe. A clan rat costs virtually nothing to recruit, equip, and train. Well, train is a grandiose word, as they are essentially militia. The Storm Vermin, however, are professional soldiers by Skaven standards, and therefore should only be used to finish off an already weakened enemy, because while there are millions of clan rats that can be thrown at any potential enemy, actually trained, loyal veteran soldiers, well, loyal as far as Skavens go, those rats are hard to come by. And at this point, you may be forgiven for thinking that the Skaven are a very one-dimensional army. They charge and wear down the enemy, or they get charged and again they just wear down the enemy. This is not true. In fact, the Skaven army, while on the surface looking to be an extremely melee-oriented army with very few ranged units, is actually one of the most dangerous armies in the Warhammer universe to stand and shoot against. Simply because the Skaven long-ranged weaponry is extremely devastating. Warp lightning cannons, plague claw catapults, rattling guns, warp fire throwers, and poison wind globadiers, while many of them may be short-ranged, they will cause massive damage when fired. And while the ranged units of the enemy, consisting of archers, crossbowmen, various black powder weaponry, cannons, etc., will be murdering vast amounts of Skaven slaves, worthless chaff placed there precisely to eat said punishment, they will be doing very little real damage to the Skaven army behind it, and all the while they will be subjugated to masses of return fire from the Skaven ranks. And whereas the incoming enemy fire will be killing chaff like Skaven Slaves, the Skaven fire will be killing elite units. They will be killing knights, they'll be killing heavy infantry. Well, pretty much anything they hit is going to be worth a hell of a lot more than what the enemy is killing. The Skaven army can also be fielded in an interesting variant with the Plague Monks, where most of your army is made up of, again, the meat shield of Skaven Slaves, but behind the Skaven Slaves come not your usual clan rats. Behind the Skaven Slaves come hordes of crazed religious zealots, infected by all manners of horrible diseases and essentially immune to the poison gas that is so often used as a weapon by their clan. So this time, if you fight your way through the Skaven Slaves, you are met by a virtual avalanche of filthy, diseased ratmen driven to heights of frenzy by the painful diseases that rack their flesh. And since they have long since gone beyond simple pain, putting down a plague monk takes quite a lot of work, thereby bogging the enemy army down even more. And all the while you're bogging them down, poisoned wind globadiers and mortars are spreading vicious gases and horrible plagues amongst your ranks, slowly withering down the toughest of opponents. The Skaven army can also be employed as a pure sledgehammer force in the form of a clan Molder army, consisting mostly of giant, horrible, mutated beasts that will charge ahead into combat, in much the same way as an ogre army might. Except whereas the ogres are quite vulnerable to incoming missile fire, in this case the massive army of brutish monsters can be protected by weak expendable giant rats that will soak up the majority of incoming fire and allow the rat ogres and other far more horrible things to slam into the enemy lines undisturbed. And that is by no means the only trick inherent to the Skaven army. They employ stealthy assassins that are the bane of any enemy artillery crew. They employ a wide variety of powerful magical items, like a halberd that allows them to shoot lightning, or the dreaded brass orb, which uses the power of warpstone to create a temporary rift between our worlds and the realm of chaos, and anyone caught in its blast radius will be dead, regardless of strength, toughness, or armor. And if that wasn't enough, the Skavens have access to some powerful magic in two specialized schools of Skaven magic, with extremely versatile spells like Skitterleap, which allows a Skaven sorcerer to teleport around the battlefield, which can get him out of tight spots or get him into the perfect position to unleash a warp lightning spell, where he casts a massive bolt of mutating lightning, causing grave damage to the unit hit. Or the dreaded Death Frenzy spell, which targets a unit of Skaven and turning a usually fairly harmless unit of clan rats into a real danger on the charged. And being so sudden is quite capable of taking many opponents by surprise. They also have access to powerful AoE spells like Scorch, which is essentially warp lightning except bigger and nastier. Or how about Cracked Call? A spell that opens up a rift in the very ground, and any unit caught by the spell has to pass an initiative test to get out of the way or fall down into the crack forming in the earth, forever lost to the world above. They also have access to several devastating pestilence spells like Pestilent Breath, a spell that uses a flamethrower template, creating a cloud of toxic vapor that spews forth from the mouth of the Plague Priest, or Filth Blessing, which gives a unit poisoned attacks, especially useful on units of frenzied Plague Monks, or units affected by Death Frenzy. Or the obscenely powerful Wither, which reduces the toughness of all nearby units by a considerable portion. And so, while your Skavens become less tough as well, the enemy, which are worth a hell of a lot more than your Skavens are in all due likelihood, are also going to get a hell of a lot easier to kill. Or Cloud of Corruption, Pestilent Breath on steroids, which affects all nearby units with stinking clouds of pestilent corruption. All of these wonderful spells means that a Skaven army doesn't rely purely on its warp lightning cannons, plague catapults, and jazziles for its powerful artillery, but is equally able to rely upon its mages to create a ton of devastation. And with basic mages in the Skaven army being both cheap and plentiful, the potential for massive magical destruction in the Skaven army is quite considerable. And this is what I love about the Skaven army. You can play it so many ways. You can play it as a Horde army, you can play it as a Hammer army, you can play it as a Frenzy army, you can play it as a Pestilent Nurgly army, you can play it as a Magical Artillery army, or you could even play it as a straight-up bombastic artillery death machine army. All of these things are possible with the Skaven race, and I dearly hope that they implement that in the game. It would be a sad day indeed to see the Skaven implemented in Total War Warhammer, and see them only be given clan rats and storm demons and a few unique units. No. We want to be able to create all of these beautiful clan armies, and I'd prefer not to pay $10 for each clan. So, if that could be avoided, that'd be pretty nice. So, I'll end it on that hopeful note. I've been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time, where I'll be talking about the orcs and goblins. Oh yes, my friends, this is going to be a good one.